Good afternoon and welcome to episode 9 of Inside Out, a monthly webcast where Thinka's co-founders and respective COO and CEO, Ben and Lee, talk through all the weird and wonderful, hard and human parts of business and leadership. This month, it's a special focus on neurodiversity in workplaces.
Today, we are really focusing on a conversation around building an inclusive learning culture. So, we're not experts in this space, especially when it comes to workplace
We
adjustment.
are in building inclusive learning
We
culture,
are
not
indeed.
neurodivergent.
So, we're just going to preface the discussion though by kind of giving you an indication of what we understand neurodiversity to mean, and then talk a little bit about how that leads into universal design and building that inclusive learning culture. So, neurodiversity sort of refers to the wide range of ways that brains function, so suggesting that variation is the norm. So that's kind of what we're looking at today, understanding that all brains are different and unique in their own way. When we use the term neurodivergent, we're talking about people who process, learn, behave, or communicate differently to what is considered neurotypical. Individuals may have ADHD, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, sensory disorder, etc. But it's probably worth noting that not everyone subscribes to this idea of neurodiversity. There are very real challenges for people, and we want to respect and understand that, which is why we're focusing our conversation today less on the psychology and more on building an inclusive learning culture.
I think the more we can help people feel the best in the environment, the best we're going to get out of them. And whether that be the learning context or the everyday work environment, those factors of personalisation help people perform because they can sit in, whether it be a leadership program and feel really connected because the environment feels good, the way in which it's presented feels good, the connection feels good, versus it feeling disconnected from who they are actually as a person. We could talk for days about this. Lee has put together 11 pages of notes around what this could look like. She may release some of those in the follow-up comms, but you could take this in so many different directions because it really is such a big bucket of trying to make sure that that learning culture works for everyone. And yes, lots of different factors might come into that, but the individualization of the person and what they need means you can go in so many different directions. Being able to not get caught on inaction by overreaction is really important. So being able to actually think about your current learning culture and, what are the 2 to 3 things that you can do now to enhance the environment in the actual physical learning culture, through the assets that we design, and maybe through the digital way in which we consume content in the organization as well, will be the first evolution. And exactly as we learn more about all of these different brains and how we work and learn differently, that'll also evolve.
When it comes to designing an inclusive workplace or thinking about how to service lots of different needs, my view is that it starts in talent. So when we're bringing people into our organizations, making sure we open up opportunities for people to reveal their best selves to us. We have a tendency to kind of over-index on interviewing as an example. So, very formal, stiff rooms with pre-prepared questions that kind of feel a bit generic.
And even when you say this is going to be quite informal, it really feels formal just because of the awkwardness and the familiarity of each other as well.
And I think just broadening the way that we measure qualification and skill. So, for example, it may not be an interview, it could be a video submission. It could be getting someone to come into the workplace and actually demonstrate the skill. It could be getting them to bring in a project or a task that they've worked on and walking the interview panel through that and showing how they solve problems, apply critical thinking, collaborated with others. So, getting them to actually be a little bit more practical on the skills side and not just throwing out the what are your strengths and weaknesses, because somebody that is neurodivergent may be too brutally honest about their weaknesses and they may not necessarily sell themselves in the best way. The best way to measure skill is to actually see the skill in action.
It sounds counterintuitive to use more technology to drive personalization, but as we know, when you can work with something like an AI tool to learn our preferences and the way in which we want something personalized, we can actually get a better result. That doesn't mean that you should go so generic in using AI tools that the content has no relevance and no context, because that would be counterproductive. There's got to be some curation around what feeds in and what comes out. But that ability to have that tool that helps us ask an AI coach some questions about how I could learn X or Y, or what we need to do A, B, and C, again, puts me in the driver's seat, helps me ask really great questions, and then therefore can have a real bias to action versus the consumption of learning, which can often feel a little bit passive or often drive to cognitive fatigue.
When we think universal design, it's not just good for neurodiversity, it's good to appeal to a broad range of people in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. The quirks of neurodiversity, it does help us get a broader lens on things. And I think often it's a good measuring stick to go, right, what are the different ways in which we could remix this content? But also it allows us to be better practitioners as well, because we can actually go, right, how could we disrupt the status quo that has maybe felt comfortable without actually creating more work for ourselves? Because with the use of tech, we can find ways for the actual learner to personalize for themselves as well. And that's something that I think is really needs to be explored more, is putting people in participation more of the time versus in being quite passive in the learning experience. Regardless of learning style, what we know from the evidence around learning environment design is everything is better experienced than explained. So you could spend a lot of time explaining a particular model, or you could just get them experiencing how that model plays out. That is going to land. It might feel overwhelming for different people to jump into what we might call the hot seat if it's a role play situation, but how you build psychological safety first up is important, but also how you get them to participate earlier is even more important. So getting them to read something prior to the session on what we're going to be covering is going to, first of all, reduce the anxiety people might be feeling coming into the environment. Now, some people might be sitting there going, yeah, but getting everybody there pre-work's impossible. Trust me, if it's important enough to the person to feel comfortable in the learning environment, they'll actually read the article or they'll make time to watch the video. That's me, for example. I need a night to sleep on things for it to cognitively process for me, so I'm good to go with it the next day.
And I think that's the biggest thing, is encouraging people to be contributors to their own learning. So designing learning experiences that allow for that aren't just about passive consumption of learning, because we're moving away from static inputs and moving towards more dynamic and personalized learning experiences, and AI will help to enable that. So adaptive learning paths, for example, where we can pull from large content repositories down into very micro-sized bites of learning and then serve that up to the individual at the right moment, kind of in response to where they're at in their learning journey or in their role right now. I think that's just going to become really important for especially people with ADHD. I think we just have to be careful, though, not to generalize too much that all ADHD people love micro learning, because that would be a lie. It's more about whether the dopamine is activated or not. So, you know, a 3-minute video can feel like a lifetime if it's boring. So we've still got to really prioritize engagement and understanding what makes an engaging piece of learning, irrespective of how long it is.
Next to that, though, is just being smart around humans more than ever before are great information filterers. So we might say people's attention spans are actually getting less, but that's not really exactly true according to the research. It's more about people are better at filtering information that is of value or no value. And when something doesn't feel like it's of value, they move on really quickly or they disengage. So it's about going, right, how do I just make sure that I can, yes, get their attention, but to keep it through the value in which the information. So if you are telling yourself, but it actually takes 20 minutes to explain this model, say to you've got to disrupt your own thinking there and just go, it might work for you, it doesn't work for your audience, and that's who you're in service to. So explain it in 3 different parts and get them participating after each explanation.
There's a lot, obviously, we've learned along the way on how to build inclusive and accessible learning experiences in the digital realm. But I think there were a couple of interesting things that I've come across in the research as we head into this kind of, I don't know, obsession with gamification and progress bars and badges and things. You know, they're great. I'm not saying that we should do away with them, but what was interesting when I was exploring the research was that they can actually lead to a sense of shame and failure in somebody, for example, with ADHD, because if they haven't completed the task on time and as expected, and they get this, you know, pop up reminding them of the fact, or they can't see the progress on the bar, it has a real demotivating effect. So sometimes we gamify things thinking that everybody thinks, oh, I've got this competitive spirit, I'm going to jump on board, I'm going to, ace this. And it actually has the opposite effect and can lead to feelings of shame, of failure, of not being good enough, which doesn't necessarily promote inclusive learning. It actually runs counterintuitive to it. So I just think we need to be cognizant when we're gamifying experiences that we're not doing it in such a way where we're promoting those feelings. It's a case of, oh, you've done great. Can we do a little bit better? And what about now? Can we go a little bit more? And sort of creating it in a way that builds on progress as opposed to punishing someone for not completing a module, etc.
High value learning is what's going to drive engagement. So we might think that making sure there's some type of interactivity right throughout a digital module is going to do that. It's actually quite the opposite. It is actually leading to cognitive fatigue. And that's not just for the people in the room that might be neurodivergent, it's for most people, because consuming information at rapid pace versus being able to absorb information is really different. So what I'd prefer to see is explain something that's quite complex, and then again, find a moment, okay, in this digital module, we're now going to play 2 minutes of reflection music. You're actually going to take a moment now to reflect on what you're going to do with that piece of learning. And then you're going to do something X with doing it, rather than doing, for example, a drag and drop of matching the right pieces of information together. So that is busy brain activity. The other is actual cognitive activity that will actually lead to the absorbing.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how that works for me, where I could apply that in my day, and what's next as an action. And that's something that we often lose in digital. We do a lot of reflection-based learning. Flip it to be action-orientated.
I think we just need to be careful that sometimes more is more. More is not better. So allowing for those moments of integration where we have, those opportunities for the brain to organize itself and integrate the knowledge and understand how it relates to that individual's existing knowledge and the context around them. And they kind of put their individual stamp on it. That's just as important as delivering the learning itself.
Last thing I would just say is, when you feel like you've got to do more, try and do less, because often it's taking the stuff away, it's finding space, it's asking questions, it's allowing the brain to use different modes, different ways, different environments to learn, versus actually feeling like you've got to do more. So put the learner in the driver's seat more of the time, so that they are fully participating or a part of the experience versus an accessory to the experience.